Competitive and sustainable regions as engines for green transitions. That's the headline of the day. And that is, of course, something really to aim for. But how do we achieve that when regional disparities are growing and most developments seem to take place in just a few metropolitan regions? As I see it, it's important that before we form strategies for green transitions on various levels, also discuss the various regional prerequisites for this and the policies that form these prerequisites. In the Nordic countries, economic growth has traditionally taken place by exploitation of primary sector resources and raw material deposits. Agriculture in Denmark, fishing in Iceland, forestry, iron ore, and oil, and so on. And this primary sector and mineral deposit economy has also formed the base for a rather regional, rather dispersed growth. And these sectors are still important for our exports, but employment are steadily decreasing in these sectors. Instead, today, it's the knowledge-intensive sectors of the economy that has the highest growth, and these sectors are mainly concentrated to the metropolitan regions. And also then the regional growth is concentrated to these regions. And many people seem to think that there are these regions that have the best prerequisites for green transitions, just because of the economies of scale that follows with a large, dense population. So in the metropolitan regions, you can say that there are good potential for efficient public transportation with environmental friendly fuels. There are short distances between food producers and the consumers, and dense housing makes heating more efficient, just to mention a few examples. This is the message that many planners and policymakers are giving us. Big is not only beautiful, but also environmentally friendly. But reality is much more complicated than that. First, even big city regions form large cohesive markets, and they do not exist isolated from the rest of the world. On the contrary, they are more dependent than ever on importing commodities, services, knowledge, and ideas. If not, innovation in all fields of society would stagnate, and so would the economy, and that would cause serious threats to social and economic sustainability. Not only in the metropolitan regions, but in all regions. So the self-supporting metropolis is not only a naive dream. I'd say it would also be very misleading to have this as a sole vision for planning and policy for green transition. The other important objection against the policy focus on dense metropolitan region is that this lopsided focus leaves all other regions in a state that almost nothing positive can be done. Because if we follow this line of reasoning, that the metropolitan regions in particular and are the ones that have the best potentials, the non-metropolitan regions, and in particular the more peripheral ones, are lacking the necessary mass and density to provide more efficient solutions to green transitions. For example, less efficient public transportation, longer distances between producers and consumers, and less dense housing. And perhaps even more important, these regions are dependent on the metropolitan regions for demand, for the goods and services produced in the regions, also for tourism, and they are dependent on the metropolitan regions for the same reason that the metropolitan regions are dependent on other regions. in the rest of the world. That is, they need to import goods, services, knowledge, ideas, and human capital in order to be innovative and sustainable. But what is then the opportunity for non-metropolitan regions that seems to have fewer opportunities for green transitions according to this sort of conventional wisdom? Is there only chance to go on as usual and skip this complicated green transition? Well, I don't think so. You don't think so either, I guess. But there is a need for a political will to achieve green transition then. If there is this will, and it includes all regions and not the one that have the highest mass and density, then policies must be formed to support such a development. Such policies, of course, partly already exist in the Nordic countries. Policies to protect the natural environment has really developed and improved. But in many cases, I'd say there is a huge lack of coordination between environmental policy and policy for a green transition on the economy and regional policy. And this holds at all levels, from the national to the local. There are separate policies run by separate ministries and agencies at national level and separate units at regional and local levels. Even though it might be a little better in Finland, as we heard yesterday, compared with the other countries. And moreover, the regional perspective is almost totally lacking in national environmental policies. In a global perspective, the Nordic countries are forerunners in green transition, but this lack of institutional coordination, I would say it's one of the biggest problems for continued green transitions of the Nordic regions. Since I'm most familiar with the Swedish context, I will take a couple of Swedish examples of this problem of lack of coordination between national environmental policy and policy for competitive regions and localities. And the first example is wind power. When the Swedish government, 2005, presented a bill for the parliament, there were many nice words about the importance of windmill construction for the sparsely populated regions where they were going to be built. In reality, the economic effects there have been very marginal. The vast majority of the labor has been non-local, and after the construction, there has been just a couple of persons working with maintenance and so on. And the windmill parks are owned by big multinational companies which take care of the profits. Had another policy been possible? I would say yes. The government could have stipulated a certain share of local ownership in the windmill parks, and local ownership means local influence. With a share of local ownership, a share of the profit would have stayed in the localities, and it would have been possible to use them in new investment for local development. But this didn't happen. July 1st this year, Norway introduced a new tax on air traffic. And the Swedish government has similar plans, and the proposal will come very soon. The aim is to reduce air traffic, and from the perspective of reducing CO2 emissions, less traffic means certain reduction of emissions. That's fine. It's excellent. But as we heard from Mika Antonen this morning about the problems, if we reduce the use of one fraction of oil crude, well, how does it affect the other fractions and the use of them? That we really don't know. And from the perspective I want to highlight here, what will be the effects for the regions that are strongly dependent on air traffic? There will, of course, not be any disasters in the short run, but with higher costs, the contacts with the national and international centers for human capital and knowledge will be a little reduced, and thereby also, I'd say, their innovation potential. With higher travel costs, their attraction as tourism destinations will be reduced. So in the long run, this might be serious effects for peripheral regions. In theory, government can compensate for this reduced accessibility by, for example, improving railway traffic, which is environmental friendly, but in reality, the peripheral regions are the ones giving the least priority in planning of new railway investments also. I have no solution to this dilemma, but I want to point at it. But what I surely can say and argue for is that if we want to have competitive and sustainable regions as engines for green transition, then the environmental and industrial policies and the regional policies in the Nordic countries must be much better coordinated. Otherwise, the regional gaps, the economic, the social, the cultural, even the mental gaps will be reinforced and bigger. And I don't think we want that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.